By March 1945, Germany was already lost. The Allied armies were advancing from every direction. Cities lay in ruins. Railways were shattered. Fuel was gone. What remained of the Third Reich was collapsing inward, day by day, under the weight of its own destruction. And yet, as defeat became unavoidable, one final order was issued. It did not call for surrender. It called for annihilation. Adolf Hitler demanded that Germany be destroyed from within. Factories, bridges, power stations, water supplies, even food stores were to be wiped out before Allied forces could reach them. Nothing was to be left behind. Not for the enemy. Not for the civilians who still lived there. The command became known as the Nero Decree. Germany, Hitler believed, had failed him. And if it could not win, it did not deserve to survive. Copies of the order moved quickly through what remained of the German command structure. Many officers read it in silence. Some welcomed it. Others understood exactly what it meant. If carried out, millions of civilians would be left without water, electricity, transport, or shelter. Entire cities would become uninhabitable ruins, not because of the enemy, but because of their own government. One man stood directly between the order and its execution. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, was responsible for Germany's remaining infrastructure. Bridges, factories, power plants. The very systems the decree demanded be destroyed. He understood the consequences immediately. Carrying out the order would not slow the Allies. It would only ensure that Germany's population suffered long after the war was over. Hunger, disease, collapse. But refusing a direct order from Hitler was not an option. Disobedience meant arrest or execution. And yet, as the days passed, Speer did something dangerous. He delayed. He questioned implementation. He issued vague instructions. He quietly encouraged local commanders to ignore the decree entirely. On paper, the order existed. In reality, it was being smothered. Every hour mattered. Every bridge left standing. Every power station untouched. Every city spared from destruction, not by bombs, but by restraint. If discovered, Speer would not be forgiven. But if he obeyed, Germany itself would be erased. The order had been given. The choice was already being made. Albert Speer understood something most men around him refused to accept. The war was already over. Germany's armies were retreating. Fuel was gone. Rail lines were shattered. Entire divisions existed only on paper. What remained of the state was being held together by fear and denial. And now with the Nero Decree, that denial had become policy. Speer's position placed him at the center of the order's execution. As Minister of Armaments, control of factories, bridges, power stations, and transport networks passed through his hands. If the decree was to be carried out, it would happen because he allowed it to happen. Publicly, Speer appeared obedient. He acknowledged the order. He discussed logistics. He nodded when expectations were laid out. Privately, he began to undermine it. Speer knew that open refusal would end his life. Hitler did not tolerate defiance, especially in the final months of the war. But obedience did not require enthusiasm, and orders, if delayed long enough, could lose their power. Speer began issuing instructions that sounded compliant but achieved nothing. He requested assessments that would never arrive. He demanded confirmations from offices that no longer existed. He allowed paperwork to pile up while time slipped away. More dangerously, he spoke to regional commanders directly, not with written orders, not with official declarations, but with quiet conversations. He told them to interpret the decree reasonably, to prioritize civilian survival, to delay irreversible actions. Some commanders complied out of fear, others out of exhaustion, a few out of conscience. Each decision added risk. Every bridge left standing was evidence. Every power station spared was defiance. Every city that still had water and electricity was a silent accusation. Speer lived under constant threat. One report, one loyalist, one intercepted message could expose him. Arrest would be immediate. Execution would follow. And yet he continued. The closer the Allies came, the more dangerous delay became. Hitler's paranoia intensified. Trust collapsed. Orders multiplied. Speer was no longer simply slowing destruction. He was racing against time. By early April 1945, delay was no longer enough. The Allies were crossing the Rhine. Cities were falling one after another. Hitler's inner circle was shrinking, and his paranoia was growing by the day. Orders arrived faster, harsher, and more desperate than before. The Nero Decree was no longer theoretical. Reports were demanded. Confirmations were expected. Proof of destruction was required. Albert Speer understood that the moment of ambiguity was ending. If the decree was to fail, it could no longer fail quietly. Speer took a risk few men would have dared. He traveled to Berlin to confront Hitler directly, not to challenge the order outright, but to reshape it from within. Standing before a leader who tolerated no dissent, Speer spoke carefully. He did not argue morality. He did not speak of civilians. He framed the issue in terms Hitler still respected: production. Speer claimed that destroying infrastructure would cripple any chance of continued resistance, that factories and transport were still needed to supply remaining forces, that premature destruction would weaken Germany faster than the enemy could. It was a dangerous argument, and it was only partially believed. Hitler did not revoke the decree, but he allowed exceptions. And in war, exceptions were everything. With that narrow opening, Speer moved quickly. He sent messages to regional authorities emphasizing preservation over destruction. He instructed officials to interpret the decree selectively. Bridges essential for retreat were spared. Power stations were kept running. Water systems were left intact. Not everywhere. Some cities were destroyed anyway. Loyalists obeyed without hesitation. Entire neighborhoods vanished because someone followed orders exactly as written. But across much of Germany, the decree fractured. It failed not because it was repealed, but because too many people chose not to carry it out fully. Each spared city represented risk. Each standing bridge was evidence. Each functioning power grid was an act of defiance. Speer knew discovery would mean death. But by then, the war was unraveling faster than punishment could reach him. The order had been given, but it was no longer absolute. And for the first time, Germany's destruction was not inevitable. By late April 1945, Germany was collapsing completely. Allied forces pushed deeper into the country. Communications broke down. Authority fractured. Orders that once carried absolute weight dissolved into confusion. The Nero Decree no longer mattered, not because it had been revoked, but because there was no one left to enforce it. Across Germany, the results of quiet resistance became visible. Bridges still stood. Power stations still functioned. Water flowed in cities that should have been reduced to ruins. Civilians survived not because of victory, but because destruction had been delayed long enough to be overtaken by defeat. Albert Speer did not emerge as a hero. When the war ended, he was arrested like the rest of the regime's leadership. At the Nuremberg trials, Speer admitted responsibility for his role in the Nazi state. He did not deny his position. He did not deny his proximity to power, but he spoke openly about the Nero Decree. He acknowledged that he had deliberately sabotaged it, that he had encouraged others to ignore it, that he had acted against explicit orders to preserve what remained of Germany's infrastructure. The admission did not absolve him. Speer was sentenced to 20 years in prison. History judged him not by the cities he saved, but by the system he served. And yet the consequences of his defiance were undeniable. Millions of civilians were spared starvation and disease. Reconstruction became possible sooner than anyone had expected. Germany, though shattered, was not erased from the map by its own hand. This is the uncomfortable truth the story leaves behind: that moral decisions do not erase responsibility, that restraint does not cancel complicity, that doing one right thing does not undo a lifetime of wrong ones. Speer acted when the stakes were highest and the outcome was uncertain. He did not stop the war. He did not redeem the regime. He only prevented its final act from being total destruction. The order failed, not because it was never given, but because enough people chose not to carry it out. History often looks for clean answers: heroes, villains, clear lines between right and wrong, but the truth rarely cooperates. Albert Speer did not stop the war. He did not dismantle the system he served. He did not prevent the suffering that came before. What he did was interrupt its final intention. The Nero Decree was meant to erase a nation out of spite, to leave nothing behind for anyone, including the people who still lived there. It failed not because it was rescinded, but because it was quietly resisted until time itself made it irrelevant. That resistance did not redeem Speer. He was still responsible for the machinery of war. He still benefited from proximity to power. He still served a regime built on violence and oppression. History does not erase that, and yet it cannot ignore what followed. Cities stood when they were meant to burn. Infrastructure survived when it was meant to vanish. Millions endured the aftermath of war with water, electricity, and shelter still intact. The question this story leaves behind is not whether Speer was good or evil. It is whether moral action can exist inside immoral systems. Whether refusing one order matters when so many others were obeyed. Whether restraint, even at the end, still counts for something. History often judges by outcomes, but people live in moments without knowing how they will be remembered. Speer acted knowing the risk, without knowing the result. He chose delay, ambiguity, and quiet defiance when obedience would have been simpler and safer. That choice did not absolve him, but it mattered. Because history is not only shaped by those who give orders, it is shaped by those who decide how fully they are willing to carry them out. And sometimes what changes the future is not action, but refusal.